Today is October 13th, 2024. As the conflict in Ukraine continues to grind on, we are starting to see the many narratives laid out by the collective West about Ukraine unraveling. I'm going to get into a couple of these, including the constantly unraveling narrative of Ukraine somehow outfighting Russia. That narrative is unraveling rapidly. The narrative regarding the Kursk incursion, that this was somehow a severe blow to Russia and not a self-inflicted blow to Ukraine itself. And Ukraine's victory in the Black Sea, that fantasy is now becoming undone. I will get into all of those in just a moment, but let's first look at the situation on the ground. I'm using liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map. It is a map that will hesitate for days, even weeks sometimes, to report on Russian progress, and it will consistently exaggerate Ukrainian success. And yet still somehow the map looks like this. So we'll look at along the line of contact from Kherson across Zaporozhye and southern Donbass. Vugledar, a heavily fortified Ukrainian position held since the beginning of the special military operation by Ukrainian forces. Not only have Russian forces admittedly taken over the entire urban area, they have now moved well beyond it. You can see here this salient extending westward from Donetsk. This has been constantly expanding every single day, despite claims by Ukraine that they have stopped Russian progress in this direction. You can see that Russian forces are right up to the built-up area in and around Pokrovsk. And we remember articles like this from September, for example. September 7, 2024, Newsweek. Ukraine halts Russia's Pokrovsk offensive, retakes part of New York, reports. And this was a very manipulative claim. When Russian forces reach a heavily fortified, built-up urban area, by necessity, they need to stop, because it's now not a process of approaching the city. It now becomes a process of encircling it, cutting off logistics, grinding down the fortified positions within the city, which is always going to be more difficult because of the nature of the concrete structures that soldiers are going to fortify and occupy. And it becomes a siege. It's a siege process. So siege by nature is you're sitting there outside the area that you're besieging, and it will take time to grind down and eventually drive Ukrainian forces out. Inevitably they will, but it is a process that has to run its course. And we have seen this repeated over and over again. Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Bakhmut, Avdiivka. Now Russian forces have arrived outside Pokrovsk, and this process is going to play out in regards to Pokrovsk. The Newsweek article also said that Ukrainian forces had taken back some positions in New York, but if you look at the map, you can see the vast majority of New York is under Russian control, and Russian forces continue moving toward Torestsk here, into Torestsk more accurately, and the situation can be said along the entire line of contact. But let's take a look at the Kursk incursion itself, this supposed devastating blow, this humiliation to Russia. Let's look at the timeline feature. This is as of October 12th. If we go back to just say October 6th, you can see that the area of operation Ukraine was working in, that has actually shrunk since then. You could see these two indents right here, and I had showed this image a few days ago, October 10th. And I pointed out how this pro-Ukrainian map indicated that Russian forces were moving into the Ukrainian area of operation in Kursk, and they were taking territory back. So that is how we went from this picture on October 10th to this one on my October 13th, their October 12th. So the Kursk incursion sold to the public as a Ukrainian victory, a devastating blow, a humiliation to Russia. I had pointed out, as it was taking place, as the opening phase of the operation was still unfolding, I pointed out the fact that this was a strategic blunder, that if Ukrainian forces couldn't even hold their own fortified positions along the line of contact, where logistics and sustainment is relatively ideal for them. How are they going to seriously hold any territory inside of Russia that much further away from the line of contact? The answer was they couldn't. And so they spent thousands and thousands of soldiers, their best equipment, their best units on this incursion for PR, for propaganda value, and now it is slowly unraveling and collapsing. And I also said at the time that because they sent their best troops, thousands of their best troops and equipment to Kursk, that it was going to compromise the rest of the line of contact. And then ever since I had said that, I read one report after the other from the Western media as admitting as much, citing Ukrainian officers, military commanders, and soldiers along the line of contact, explaining how much worse the situation had gotten since the Kursk incursion. It was supposed to be a diversion, supposedly, but it did the exact opposite. It just made it that much easier for Russian forces along the line of contact to advance. And we see that on this pro-Ukrainian live map. Now, let's get into some of the articles about Russian advances. I had not covered this because I had not done an update on Ukraine for probably 2 weeks. So this is the first one in October, actually. Russians claim key city of Vugledar in Ukraine's east. This was all the way back October 2nd. The article says Russian troops have taken complete control of the eastern city of Vugledar, which Ukrainian forces have been defending since the beginning of Moscow's full-scale invasion 2.5 years ago. Ukraine's Eastern Military Command confirmed that they had told the troops still fighting in parts of Vugledar to pull back to avoid becoming surrounded. For more than 2 years, Russia has been trying to take this city in order to advance further north and reach regional transportation hubs. Well, now they are well on their way to doing so. It also says Moscow's enormous advantage in weapons and troops. Some soldiers have estimated the ratio of forces as 7-to-1, enabled them to break through Ukrainian defense lines along the flanks and approach Vugledar. Well, that's what happens when you send thousands and thousands of your best troops off to go conduct a PR campaign inside Kursk, and you leave your line of contact underdefended. That's what will happen. But this was going to happen inevitably anyway. Russia is not prioritizing the taking of territory. People who you constantly hear using the amount of territory being held or lost or the rate at which it is being gained as the metric of success or failure for either side, they are fundamentally flawed in their analysis. This is a war of attrition. The metrics that you use to determine its success or failure is the number of troops that you're able to destroy and the equipment that you're able to destroy, the fortifications you're able to grind down, versus what you yourself are losing, your ability, and also your enemy's ability to reconstitute combat power. Russia has a vast advantage over Ukraine and its Western sponsors, and that is what is allowing them to shape the battlefield in the way we see even pro-Ukrainian maps depicting. What else does the BBC article say? It says Ukrainian defense lines were devastated by Russia's aviation bombs and thermobaric weapons, in addition to drones and multiple rocket launchers, obviously also artillery. Now, since we're talking about Kursk and this short-term propaganda victory versus long-term strategic blunder, we see something else very similar playing out in the Black Sea. You may remember some of these articles from the Western media, Time Magazine, the drone wars, how Ukraine beat Russia in the Battle of the Black Sea. Though it has no large warships in its navy, Ukraine has used these drones to outmaneuver one of the largest naval powers in the world. These strikes have forced the rest of the Russian navy to pull back from Ukrainian shores, all but conceding defeat in the greatest sea battle Europe has seen since World War II. The hyperbole and the rampant propaganda to try to depict that as some kind of victory. What they did do, what Ukraine successfully did, was create anti-access area denial in a certain part of the Black Sea. They forced Russia to relocate their Black Sea fleet further east, out of the range of these drones and the long-range missiles that the West had transferred over to Ukraine. In that sense, they were successful. The problem is that Russia was using its Black Sea fleet primarily to launch cruise missiles at targets across Ukraine, and they're still doing that, uninterrupted. That was something Ukraine never succeeded in stopping. Ideally, Russia would like to use its fleet to interdict shipping in the Black Sea, to stop and board and inspect vessels supposedly carrying grain that might actually be carrying weapons to Ukraine. Ideally, they would like to do that. But at any time of their choosing, should they decide to stop shipping in the Black Sea, that is well within their power to do so. They wouldn't be able to use their surface vessels, but as I had pointed out many times before, they have submarines operating in the Black Sea, and they also have a large number of anti-shipping vessels. They can use expendable unmanned aerial drones to identify targets and use their anti-shipping missiles to strike at them. They could stop shipping in the Black Sea overnight if they wanted to. How about this article from Foreign Affairs? Ukraine's victory at sea, how Kiev subdued the Russian fleet, and what it will need to build on naval success. You will see the supposed victory in the Black Sea by Ukraine as an example of Ukraine's ability to outright win the entire war. Here's another one from SIPA. What is SIPA? It is another one of these US government and corporate funded think tanks. Here's the National Endowment for Democracy. That is the US government. You have Lockheed Martin, Qualcomm, General Atomics, and on and on. What do they say? They say Black Sea successes in Ukraine's path to victory. Ukraine's operational success in the northwestern Black Sea offers a beacon of light which, with Western support, could chart the way to eventual victory over Russia. No, it cannot. And let's get back to reality. Here is reality. This is Reuters, October 8th, 2024. Ukraine says Russian missiles strike 2 Black Sea grain vessels. And I figured that this was inevitable, that at some point later on in the conflict, there would be a necessity for Russia to at least demonstrate the ability to stop shipping in the Black Sea. This was something that Russia does on a large scale, reserves a large number of options to escalate. It reserves them to use as leverage against the collective West, which is constantly escalating against Russia. And what they're demonstrating by hitting these ships is that they can stop shipping in the Black Sea. Now, the Russian statements that I've seen hint that there were weapons on these ships. Apparently, I haven't seen any evidence of that. Doesn't mean that it's not true, that there isn't some way for Russia to know that. I have not seen any evidence of that. But what is Russia ultimately, objectively, without assuming anything, what this proves is that at any time of Russia's choosing, they could stop shipping in the Black Sea with their missiles, which was obvious all along. And what the collective West did was take advantage of the fact that they knew Russia was reserving this for escalation management for a later date. And in the meantime, they were going to hail this as some massive Ukrainian victory, the fact that shipping was reestablished in the Black Sea. So just like the Kursk incursion, entirely fabricated, imagined victory, repeated over and over again until in the minds of many it became fact. And now at this later stage in the conflict, it is fully and completely unraveling. How would Ukraine and its Western sponsors reestablish shipping in the Black Sea if Russia decided to start sinking all of these ships with missiles? There really is nothing they could do about it. Here's something else the Reuters article says. Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Kuleba identified the vessel as the Optima. So they're talking about the different ships that have been hit. And this is what Kuleba says. He says, Russia is attempting in this way to destroy shipping in the Black Sea, guaranteeing food security. The consequences can only mean greater instability in sensitive regions dependent on food imports and tensions in international relations, Kuleba said. So again, if you achieved this victory in the Black Sea, how is it possible that Russia is undoing it now? Because that victory was only ever imagined. Now, it's interesting what the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine is saying, that this is jeopardizing international food security. This is a narrative that you would think the collective West would jump on and support fully, using the full extent of their media influence around the globe, but they're not. We see articles like this in Reuters, the BBC, a few other places, very muted coverage. They're admitting that it's happening, but they are not putting it in the headlines. They are not emphasizing this. And why is that? And I heard Alexander Mikuris of the Duran bring up a very good point. If the collective West runs with this narrative that shipping in the Black Sea is now being disrupted and under threat by Russia, that undoes months and months, if not years, of this narrative claiming Ukraine achieved this victory in the Black Sea. All of these articles, all across the Western media, spanning months, again, if not years, all reveal themselves as shoddy analysis at best, a coordinated propaganda campaign at worst. Now, despite all of this, despite looking at the pro-Ukrainian life map, watching Ukrainian troops falling back away from the line of contact, watching entire Ukrainian cities taken by Russian forces, despite watching this victory in the Black Sea evaporate before our very eyes, we still have a torrent of Western propaganda trying to convince us that despite all of what we're seeing with our own eyes, somehow Ukraine is outfighting Russia. We have this article from the New York Times, October 10th, 2024. September was deadly month for Russian troops in Ukraine. U.S. says more than 600,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded since the war began in 2022. I've gone over the casualty numbers many times. I've cited the Media Zona BBC project many times, showing just a fraction of, looking at actual evidence. What they can account for is a fraction of what the U.S. and others are claiming Russia has lost. The New York Times article says, according to U.S. assessments, Russian casualties in the war so far number as many as 615,000, with 115,000 Russians killed and 500,000 wounded. Ukrainian officials have zealously guarded their casualty figures, even from the Americans. That is ridiculous. The Americans want to pretend that they don't know, so they don't have to admit them, and they can play dumb when they give their lowball estimates, and it turns out that it was many times higher. And with that in mind, it says, but a U.S. official estimated that Ukraine has suffered a bit more than half of Russia's casualties, or more than 57,500 killed and 250,000 wounded. How could that possibly be? Looking at the live UA map, pro-Ukrainian map, watching Ukraine falling back, watching entire Ukrainian cities taken by Russia, other cities on the verge of being taken by Russia, the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk crumbling, the vaunted Black Sea victory of Ukraine, again, up in smoke in the ports of Odessa. How could this possibly be? How is it that Ukraine cannot recruit enough men? And I'll get into that in just a moment. The men they can recruit, they cannot train properly. And this inadequate number of men, inadequately trained, are inadequately armed and have access to inadequate amounts of ammunition. And yet somehow they're still killing twice as many Russians as they themselves are losing. It does not add up. So let's look at some of the, as that New York Times article sits there telling us this, we have articles like this elsewhere in the Western media. From the Times, conscription tactics get dirty as war-weary Ukrainians defy draft. Under pressure to mobilize 200,000 extra soldiers, Ukraine army recruiters are resorting to checkpoints, bundling men off the streets and ignoring exemptions. When I say they're ignoring exemptions, I mean they're taking amputees, people who have HIV, hepatitis, and they are sending them to the front line. Now, they cannot, that is an admission that they cannot recruit enough men. They say there's 1 million soldiers in the Ukrainian military and they need 200,000 more. If you believe that, after seeing the situation on the ground, I don't know what else I could do to help you shape a more realistic picture of this conflict. But remember articles like this, June 2nd, 2024, basic training in Ukraine is barely covering the basics, commanders say. This is about how the few troops that they can manage to conscript are not even being trained properly before they arrive at front lines. And I've talked about this extensively, how actual effective basic training could take up to half a year. These conscripts are getting just a few days, sometimes a couple of weeks of training. How at this point, Ukraine has lost so many soldiers, they need to reconstitute entire brigades of 4,000 men or more, which could take 2 to 3 years to effectively stand up, organize, train, and prepare for actual combat. Now, if you go to Media Zona, this US government-funded Russian opposition group's website, in conjunction with British state media, the BBC, this is the only attempt I've seen in the West to provide any sort of evidence, any sort of backing to their claims of Russian losses. They're saying 72,899 Russians have died in this conflict. That's what they have evidence for. Then they very recently created this probate registry estimate, which is just a way of Media Zona confirming what the Western media and what the US government is claiming Russia has lost. There's no evidence that it's 120,000 dead. You can see how suspiciously close that is with the number in the New York Times article. But if you go down to where they're keeping track of the losses, if you actually look at this timeline from February 2022 all the way up to September 2024, you can see how it has gone down and then up again and then down and then up again. The largest amount of losses were in January, late 2022, early 2023. We had this other uptick. This was around the time Avdiivka was being taken by Russian forces. And then we can see the rate has been dropping. It has been dropping. And even though for Media Zona, this project, there is maybe a 1 or 2 month delay, that drop includes months far beyond the 1 to 2 month delay where statistics are still coming in. So what this is telling us is that what they actually have evidence for is much less than what the US is claiming Russia has lost, much less than the Ukrainian government is claiming Russia has lost. The rate of deaths are dropping, even though we're hearing they're unprecedented. And so what we're seeing right now is the disparity growing between the propaganda that the collective West has been using to maintain support behind this conflict in Ukraine and reality. They're diverting away from each other. The deaths of Russian soldiers are dropping as the disparity between combat power on the battlefield is growing in Russia's favor. And this is only just going to get worse and worse for Ukraine. As Russian losses are dropping, Ukrainian losses are only going to be increasing. They admit, the Western media admits, they cannot find enough troops to reinforce Ukrainian positions. The troops they are sending to the front to reinforce Ukrainian positions are improperly trained, which means they're going to die at a greater rate. Ukraine is in an irreversible spiral downwards. There's no way to reverse this by simply providing support to Ukraine, as the collective West has been doing. Really, the only way this could be reversed is a direct intervention by the collective West itself. And the probability of success of a direct US NATO intervention in Ukraine, the probability of that being successful in the sense of ejecting Russia out of what Ukraine claims is its territory, is very, very low. Much lower than the probability this will escalate out of control into a nuclear war. But I just want to point out this dangerous narrative that we see taking shape, where we are now continuously hearing about Ukraine being admitted into NATO now as the conflict continues. Now, ordinarily, a nation is not allowed to join NATO if it is engaged in active conflict with another nation. The reason why is because when you join NATO, you are now protected under Article 5. It's a collective defense clause. It's right here on NATO's official website, Article 5. Collective defense in Article 5. And it says down here, Article 5 provides that if a NATO ally is the victim of an armed attack, each and every other member of the alliance will consider this an act of violence as an armed attack against all members and will take actions it deems necessary to assist the ally attack. Now, that could mean anything. The actions that are deemed necessary could mean anything. And if Ukraine was admitted into NATO today and Russia continued attacking, the actions deemed necessary to assist the ally being attacked could just be the continuation of shipping arms and ammunition and all the other means of support the collective West has already been providing Ukraine all along. But by admitting Ukraine into NATO in the middle of a conflict and trying to extend Article 5 over Ukraine, even if it's just partially, over the territory that Ukraine currently holds and not over the territory Russia now holds, it would entirely undermine NATO as a supposed defensive organization. I think the illusion that it is a defensive organization has been shattered long ago. And if Russia continues attacking Ukrainian-held territory, despite its admission into NATO and now Article 5 extending over these areas Ukraine holds, that will completely undermine Article 5 itself. And what it will do, just like the Kursk incursion, just like the Black Sea victory, Ukraine joining NATO will be a very short-lived, albeit tremendous propaganda coup for the collective West. But all it's going to do is paint the collective West even deeper into this corner they are working themselves into. Now, this Guardian article here is talking about Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's victory plan. They're also still talking about these long-range strikes. Let's look at what they say about this victory plan. Vladimir Zelensky has said a ceasefire with Russia is not under discussion with Ukraine's European allies, as he urged more Western support ahead of winter during the whistle-stop tour of 4 capitals. The Ukrainian president discussed his proposed victory plan with the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy, as well as the incoming head of NATO. The next peace summit has to be in November. The plan will be on the table. Early November, the plan will be with all the details, so nobody knows what this plan is. I suspect it is the immediate admission of Ukraine into NATO. The Ukrainian president told reporters in Paris when asked about a potential peace conference. He dismissed reports he was discussing the terms of a ceasefire with Russia, citing Russian disinformation, and gave no details in London or Paris on the victory plan. Well, as Ukraine defines victory, which is taking back all territory it claims is Ukrainian that is now under Russian control, there is no plan for victory. Victory is impossible for Ukraine. I think everyone admits that by now. What the actual plan most likely entails, the only thing that I can think that the collective West could even do at this point, rather than simply admitting defeat, would be admitting Ukraine into NATO. I can understand the temptation for the West to admit Ukraine into NATO immediately. The propaganda value would be off the charts. However, just like everything else the collective West has done throughout this conflict, the short-term propaganda value will come at the expense of long-term strategic catastrophe. What they will be doing is deepening their commitment to Ukraine, locking in the collective West's military capabilities right there in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, vis-a-vis Russia. They would no longer be able to commit these resources anywhere else, including the Middle East and the Asia-Pacific region. This whole conflict in Ukraine with Russia is part of a much larger geopolitical objective the US has, which is to maintain primacy over the entire planet. They have a encirclement and containment policy against Russia, Iran, and China. And if you look at a map, that means basically encircling the core of Eurasia, Russia, Iran, China. Look at it on a map. By committing fully to Ukraine, what is left of their military capacity, they're going to be forfeiting the Middle East and Asia Pacific. And by doing so, they're only going to accelerate the transformation of the world from this US-led unipolar order to a multipolar world. They're also going to be creating a very dangerous situation vis-a-vis Russia, where now direct conflict with Russia is more likely than ever before. Now, one thing I will say about NATO admission for Ukraine is kind of a variation of the US-NATO buffer zone in Ukraine that I've warned about since the special military operation began in February 2022. It will be very similar to the US buffer zone in Syria. They occupy eastern Syria. They create a sort of umbrella over the armed militant groups that they were trying to use to overthrow the Syrian government. They have failed utterly to overthrow the Syrian government. They're unable to move out and take additional Syrian territory. As a matter of fact, they are losing territory to incremental gains by Syria and its allies. And all while this is happening, Syria and its allies, including Iran, Russia, China, they continue working on the overall transition from unipolar to multipolar. And as that transition continues, the US position in Syria continues to weaken. And if the US repeated a very similar scenario in Ukraine with a buffer zone, with a permanent US NATO presence in Ukraine, they would be doing the exact same thing. They're locking themselves in place. They're committed to keeping their presence there. If they withdraw, it's a huge admission to a weakness. It further undermines their primacy. It is a lose-lose situation for them. But this is when you are pursuing an unsustainable, unachievable, irrational foreign policy objective. These are the only options you leave for yourself. Painting yourself into a corner you will never get out of. So I will keep an eye on all of that. I will continue covering not only this conflict in Ukraine. I have an update coming up on the situation in the Middle East, which has significantly escalated in the last 2 weeks. I've not been able to cover that. I will start covering that. And of course, the continued growing tensions in Asia Pacific. We have to remember that while the US is committed to encircling and containing Russia and waging proxy war against Iran in the Middle East, their primary adversary is China, because China is not just surpassing the United States, but the collective West. And there's going to be a certain point, certain threshold that is crossed. Maybe it has already been crossed, where China does surpass the collective West irreversibly, and there's nothing the US and its proxies in Europe can do about it. To just keep following those developments as they come. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I back up all of my videos on Telegram and also on Rumble. So if I'm ever deleted by YouTube, please at least bookmark it so you can find it easily if my YouTube channel suddenly disappears. In the video description of every video are all of the links that I reference, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no additional resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.